Good evening. This is a public presentation on some very interesting erosion and shoaling issues that the town has been dealing with for a number of years. We're going to have a discussion from John Ramsey of Sustainable Coastal Solutions. We are going to be taping this presentation, so we'll be shown live on Channel 18 as well as taped for archive and viewing at a later date. Just a reminder for those that are online, this is also able to be a remote hybrid type session. So if you do have questions, you will be able to ask questions at the tail end of the presentation. We do have somebody monitoring that, and you will be, if you raise your hand at the appropriate time, we will call you out. So for those online through the Teams, please keep your camera off and muted. Other than that, I really don't want to take any time. I want to introduce John Ramsey again. John is from Sustainable Coastal Solutions. I indicated, a very prominent local firm dealing with these issues. He's been dealing with Chatham erosion and coastal processes for a number of years, so he's very well versed in the issues that we deal with, and they are not small issues at times. Sometimes they are very substantial, as we all know. So I'm going to jump it right into John and let him take it off.
Okay. Thanks, Ted. So I'm here to actually give you guys an update and talk about two projects that we've been working on. One is sort of a overall study of the Chatham South Coast. Obviously, that is something that's been ongoing for a long time, and the town has been proactively doing quite a bit of nourishment in those areas. And then I'm also going to talk about this, the Crescent Beach and Stage Harbor Entrance project. That's something that's become fast and furious, as Ted had said. Some very abrupt things happened around 2017 where Fool's Cut opened and changed a lot of the dynamics, and certainly has created some unique problems for the town, and those are anticipated to be ongoing as things change. But I'll be talking about both projects. I'll say it now. I'm going to do the South Coast first. And then I'll have a slide that just says, hold your questions on everything till the end. Probably be easier, but I am breaking the presentation into two separate pieces. So just as a quick aside there, the picture on the top is the Stage Harbor entrance, and we have the dredge working in there just to give it some scale. That was when you were having some very severe shoaling coming from around Fool's Cut. And on the bottom, just some historical, look at a historical shoreline along the south shore there. This is a photo from 1938, so that would be just about 3 months after the 38 hurricane. Give you an idea of some of the data that we have and that we've been looking at to evaluate the system. The one thing you notice there is there are no coastal engineering structures along the coast at that time, other than a very short jetty at Mill Creek, which had been overwhelmed even at that time. So again, I'm going to be talking about the Chatham South Coast. There's been significant changes over the long term, but the short term, the changes are quite a bit smaller once coastal engineering structures went in. But this kind of gives you an idea of some of the transition time period. This is just a photo back in the 60s of Bucks Creek entrance. Bucks Creek and at the time Cockle Cove Creek were actually separated, and there were some barrier beaches out front. So it made the system very different the way it acted. Ridgevale and Cockle Cove beaches acted quite a bit different than they do today. So one of the things that I did want to talk about briefly is that, as Ted had mentioned, we've been doing work here in Chatham for quite a long time. We had done some previous studies for the whole South Coast. This was something that, or the South Shore. This is something that we had been working on through the town projects, as well as some work that we did through the Army Corps of Engineers. But we did quite a bit of modeling analysis and shoreline change evaluation to give a good historical perspective about what's going on, and then taking that forward and doing actually some wave modeling, sediment transport modeling, so that we come up with some predictive tools for how your beach nourishments would act, how coastal engineering structures could influence the way that beach nourishment and or the sediment transport acts, so that we could actually have more of a predictive approach to some of the management solutions that you guys might want to go after in the future. So we looked at alongshore sediment transport. There was some evaluation, at least less quantitatively, but for cross-shore. And when cross-shore, I mean sediment that's moving offshore rather than along the shore. And then obviously storm overwash, when we do get major hurricanes or major storms that can overtop the beach, we looked at some of those issues. And then sea level rise is something else that we touched on. And I guess I'm now competing with over at the library is it the library where they are looking at a sea level rise presentation? The theater? Or the theater, sorry. So I don't mean to be competing, but I will be touching on some of those same topics. One of the things I did want to point out, we certainly have evaluated the whole shoreline here from Red River all the way over to Stage Harbor in this Stage Harbor entrance in this study. And one of the things that's interesting to look at is the amount of shoreline change that has happened. And this is out here, that green line is the 1938 shoreline. And then you can see where your present shoreline is. So after 1938, once all these structures went in, and this goes all the way upstream, from Yarmouth over all the way to here, all those structures that went in, the sediment transport is generally going from west to east. All those structures blocked the sand transport. And so one thing that happens is you get, some major erosion in all of those areas. And this kind of just keeps hopping along the coast, where you have more glacial features that are harder to erode even with or without the structures, the erosion tends to be less. So that Forest Beach area tends to, right down the Town Landing tends to be a more erosion resistant feature. So again, at Red River, we have that barrier beach that gets overtopped over time, and we had a lot of change, but we also had some barrier spits that were out in front of this area back in the 30s that have long since disappeared. So then we also look at sediment transport. Sediment transport rate in this area just east of Red River is actually pretty low because the Red River jetty actually blocks the waves. So you don't get a lot of sediment transport going in that area. And then it picks up as we go along the shoreline over towards Mill Creek. So it gets stronger and stronger as we head in that direction. Next section, as we move along at Mill Creek, you see those old barrier beach segments that are out here. We didn't bother trying to calculate shoreline change in those areas just because those have now welded under the shore and they've just kind of disappeared. But this gives you an idea, again, just the fact that Mill Creek was jettied at one point, that the big offset you have between Mill Creek and the beaches to the east. That just kind of robbed all the sand from that area, and so those beaches eroded back. Again, sediment transport, we saw this part before, but again, the Mill Creek jetty blocks the waves from coming this direction. And so in this area, you have very low sediment transport. The town has placed some material there. It's done pretty well as far as staying there because it doesn't have a lot of transport. Cockle Cove Beach, the sediment transport starts picking up. This has been a big area to nourish that beach as kind of a feeder source for the rest of the beach. And it's done very well at basically maintaining that Cockle Cove, Ridgevale area. And obviously with the parking lot being always right against the shoreline, it makes it a bit of a challenge. But that's certainly that beach nourishment has done a good job of helping over time. Oops, went the wrong way, didn't I? And then finally, Hardings Beach. One of the things that is worth noting here is you see the arrows of sediment transport are actually very small there. As that shoreline wraps around, you actually don't get a lot of sediment going along shore. Most of the loss of sand that we see there is actually cross-shore movement, where sand is moved offshore. So that, just because of the shape of the shoreline, you start getting kind of a decrease in the amount of sand that is being able to move along shore. So it just, basically that's the end of the system. You certainly do get, have had some accretion. The blue lines show accretion since 38. But again, it's not as massive as some of the changes. Even though you have pretty good wave energy there, you don't see a huge buildup of sand the way you do in some of the other areas along the shoreline. So as part of this evaluation that we did, it was kind of a two-phase evaluation. We did some more qualitative look at the processes, and then we looked at a couple areas more quantitatively. And so sort of our whole overall look at this was looking at various options, the do-nothing option, which is something that every regulator always requires you to look at, whether it makes sense or not. Just doing what we've been doing, the status quo, which is doing some targeted placement of nourishment, then looking at larger scale beach and dune nourishment, and then evaluating what sand trapping structures can do. And sand trapping structures can take two forms. One is just a groin, which is a shore perpendicular structure on the beach. and the other one is jetties, where that's a shore perpendicular structure at an inlet. So they're basically the same types of structures, but they are called different things. And then look at some other types of structures that can attenuate waves, some sort of offshore breakwater. And we looked at those types of structures, whether they be submerged, artificial reef type structures, or something that's emergent. And I can talk a little bit briefly about that. And classic revetments or seawalls. That's something that we all have seen. They do make that line and draw that line in the sand, but again, they are something that is you have to maintain, and very often you lose the beach in front of them. So being able to walk along the shoreline becomes a problem in the long term. And then other soft protection measures, all the various types of things that people have come up with, whether it be core fiber logs or any of the fencing. We have jute sand-filled envelopes. There's a whole there's a whole industry out there of ideas that can be considered kind of soft rather than quote-unquote hard engineering structures that most people look as traditional concrete or rock. And then a combination of any of those features. So that sort of was our overall look at things. And within that, and again, I'm not going to read this slide, but one of the things that anybody who's been involved in Massachusetts, the myriad of regulations that we have to go through to get things permitted is pretty challenging. And in your beaches on the south side really have some unique challenges in that plovers are nest here. It's always been a challenge, and you also have horseshoe crabs as well as winter flounder and other types of environmental issues that you need to be concerned about, as well as the concept that all your dunes and beaches are natural features that actually protect the upland from flooding. And so you really need to make sure that anything you do, you're making sure that you're not having an adverse impact to the environment. And those regulations went in basically in the 70s. And so all of the structures that we've looked at historically and all those aerial photos went in long before the 1970s. So they didn't have the environmental regulations. And the environmental regulations, if you think about it, are just a reaction to the over-construction of all those structures and saying, hey, wait a second, we created this big impact, we can't let this go in the future. So one of the things that's hard, I'll state it at least right now, it's hard to go back and say, okay, we saw all the ills we did, let's pull all the structures, which is a great idea, but it's functionally, you got to get somebody to start and make that happen. And it's hard to go back in time and do that in a realistic manner. Ideally, it would be great if a lot of the structures hadn't been built, and certainly some of the bigger ones were not as big as they are. But trying to go back and get people to change that is especially when you're dealing with multiple towns along the south side, it's a big challenge. So I will go into this a little bit. So one of the things, this is sort of a broad brush, again, the qualitative look. So one of the things that we looked at is the rehabilitation of Mill Creek, the West Jetty. One of the things that's happening, if any of you have been out there, is we have a leaky jetty. If you were to reconstruct that entire jetty, your construction cost would be very high. And that's why we looked at it in here. But at the same time, if you were just doing some fixes to where the sand's flowing through, that cost would actually probably be pretty moderate, might even be low depending on how much you're doing, and it might be worthwhile. Certainly once you do that, your annual maintenance cost is pretty minimal, and you can get some good life out of a structure. When you do rock structures in a wave environment like this, which is relatively mild compared to the open Atlantic, you can get a good 50 years out of rock structures. So, so that gives you an idea there. We looked at a variety of different, wood bulkheads or extensions of armor stone, wood groins, et cetera. And you can kind of go through these and get where the high and low are. But one of the issues, I have this annual maintenance and monitoring. If you see some of these, the Cockle Cove armor stone groins or wood groins or emergent breakwaters and hardings, which I will talk about, the annual maintenance and monitoring is pretty extensive. And that's just a requirement of regulatory agencies for very good reasons. If you put in a structure that's going to block sand, they want to know it's not having any adverse impact. So they're going to make you monitor it, and that monitoring goes in perpetuity. So, and the permit conditions for something like that will say, if you're monitoring in perpetuity and we see an impact, you have to mitigate in perpetuity as well. So right now, if you don't have the structure, Ridgevale Beach, for example, might erode a bit, and you can say, well, we don't have the money to fix it or to repair it right now, we'll wait. But if you put in a structure and it's permitted, you're going to have a condition that requires you to go and fix that issue immediately. So that's just something to keep in mind when I'm talking about structures. They have benefits and detriments, but I just wanted to kind of flesh that out a little bit. And then, the one thing at the bottom here is the continued beach nourishment efforts on the South Coast. The construction cost, it's low relative to a lot of the others that we're looking at. It's, you guys have spent a decent amount of money, but the one advantage you have, and I should touch on Forest Beach a little bit, but if you're looking at from Cockle Cove east, you're able to use the county dredge, which makes it pretty low cost relative to anywhere else in the country that you're going to have to be dredging. They dredge at a very reasonable rate, and they will let you get away with relatively moderate environmental regulatory stuff, and as long as you keep up with it, 20 to 50 years is a good design life. Based on what we expect sea level rise to be, you can probably keep up with it for at least, depending on what we use for a sea level rise projection, you can certainly keep up with this for the next 20 to 50 years. So that just gives you an idea of some of the different alternatives we looked at a qualitative level. I do want to talk a bit about, as we jumped forward, the two areas we focused on for the study were, because it's beaches that basically have that are public now at Cockle Cove and at Hardings are two of the beaches we focused on, and that was what we were directed to do. Obviously, one of the issues that always comes up is, further west is certainly a concern. That area has eroded. But one of the things that's going to need to happen over time is if monies are spent that way, it's public access easements to make sure if you're using public money to place material there, public access easements are a requirement of the state permits. So keep that in mind. And the other thing is it is further west. So pumping from Stage Harbor or pumping from other, even if Ted eventually potentially gets this permitted for the borrow site or the, we'll call it borrow site, the dump site for when the Army Corps dredges Stage Harbor where they dump it offshore of Hardings Beach. Even if you have that, it's kind of a long pump for the county to go all that far. So this might be something that might be more expensive for a private dredger to do, a larger dredge, but it's something for the town to think about in the future. So I'm just going to kind of go through these photos just to give a little bit of a historical perspective. This is December 38. This is the photo I showed at the beginning. But one of the things you see here is Mill Creek, and at the time Mill Creek basically was blocked off because at the time there was so much sand coming down the coast that it was filling the jetty. They put full to entrapment, was gotten around that. Cockle Cove Creek came out here. Bucks Creek was connected to Cockle Cove Creek that way at the time. So Cockle Cove Creek came directly out straight behind a barrier spit. And these are all kind of placed in the same location. You go back, you go to 1969 when all of a sudden now you see the growing field updrift here, and all of a sudden that sediment's cut off. This has been extended now. Mill Creek looks a lot cleaner, but this beach has started to collapse and come into the shoreline. And now you see Bucks Creek open this way. Cockle Cove is still over here. And finally, we get to 2000. Obviously, Cockle Cove Creek now goes and flows behind Ridgevale Beach and out Bucks Creek. So that's a big change, but it's also all that collapse of all that sand that had been offshore is now attached to the land. And so over the last 25 to 40 years, we've been dealing with this system, not necessarily the historical system that existed prior to the structures going in. And obviously, that 69 photo that I showed is kind of the transition in between the two as the sediment was initially cut off and then moved down the beach. Or didn't move down the beach, didn't get here to where we need it. And so we go through and we start doing a quantitative analysis. This is just the different shorelines. And one of the things you see is that the large scale change we see at Cockle Cove and Ridgevale Beach. We see a lot of marching back of the shoreline. No big surprise there. If we go to Hardings Beach, as I said, the sediment transport is not nearly as strong going along the beach. And the erosion there has been much more modest over time. And again, the one thing that's nice about here, there's no real structures other than at Stage Harbor entrance, but there's no real structures along that beach. We have the structures back close to Bucks Creek with the groin right here, but for the most part, that beach is relatively structure-free compared to most of the South Shoreline there. And so again, this doesn't go all the way back to 38. This actually goes to 1969, just to give you guys a reference. The 38 shoreline would even be further seaward than what you see here. And so these are the shoreline change rates. We try to look at them in a very, I guess I'll say a different way than a lot of people look at them. We always are looking at, okay, what's happened recently, and then what happened historically a long time in the past. So if we're looking from 69 to 1995, so it's basically before there was a lot of active management of beach nourishment in the town, one of the things is that we see is this is a pretty significant erosion rate, and then again, fairly stable, and then a big accretion by Stage Harbor. If we look from 2016 to October 2020, more the recent change, and this kind of goes with when you guys are placing sand more proactively, you end up with, because you're nourishing down here, you're getting a much better reaction at Ridgevale Beach. The Cockle Cove nourishment acts as a feeder. So that's the kind of that concept of you nourish upstream and you let it flow downstream, and that keeps Ridgevale Beach stable. I know there's people have talked about whether they're concerned about Bucks Creek shoaling in. That's not really a concern. It shoals and then the shoals break away. But it seems to bypass very, very well. It does look sometimes like it's occluded in some way, but in general, it seems to flush right out. And we've taken tide measurements in there, and they seem to show that even when it's occluded, that you get really good tidal flushing. So we really don't see that as a big issue. And so certainly from the standpoint of doing nourishment, we think that concept of a feeder beach and keeping that Ridgevale Beach system healthy. Same thing for Hardings Beach. If you put sand there, it maintains the parking lots and the beach for good longevity. So I should at least talk about some of the analysis techniques we use. For this system, we use wave models. Again, pretty much all the waves here are wind-driven. It's all Nantucket Sound waves. There's no big ocean waves that we need to worry about. But we go through a whole series. We model all of Nantucket Sound, and then we come up with these subgrids in the various areas right along this is the Hardings Beach subgrid, and then this is further west. But it gives you an idea, and we actually develop a shoreline evolution model, so we can see as the waves drive sand, how that makes the shoreline move, and we calibrate it to what actually happened. So it gives us an idea that our models are very good at predicting what is going to happen if now also we use that model to throw in a structure and see how that's going to work. And so out of that model, we get sediment transport rates, and there's just more of a refined look at them. Cockle Cove Beach, again, it's kind of sheltered a little bit, so where the nourishment is placed actually has a relatively low transport rate, and as you move along Ridgevale Beach, it gets higher and higher. It's not really a surprise, but so if you place it down here, this kind of just feeds slowly into the system, and the design life we've been able to model seems to work very well with actually what's being observed out of the nourishment projects. Again, at Hardings, we don't have what we would consider a strong alongshore transport. What we have is a lot of transport, but it goes both directions. Some, depending on the wave conditions, it may go east. Other wave conditions drive it west. But when we do look at long-term change, we do see that the shoreline naturally wants to march back, which is part overwash and part cross-shore transport, where the sand is getting yanked off the beach. But in general, we don't have that stream of flow like we do everywhere else, which makes us think, and it goes into the alternatives. When you have some unidirectional flow, it's easy to put up a groin that's going to block that flow, and that would accrete material on the updrift side, and on the downdrift side, it's going to maybe rob it, but at least that you can block it with groins. Groins really wouldn't be effective in a beach where the transport's going back and forth. They just don't block the sand. So here we might look at something like offshore breakwaters that just mute the wave climate and just slow down the ability of waves to take sand off the beach. So that's why it's sort of a different management technique that we would be looking at in a system like that. This is kind of gives you an idea of the types of things that we looked at. One of the things I will point out, a lot of people talk, again, as a coastal engineer, being in this field for decades, I get every snake oil salesman who's invented a new technique for making beaches wonderful again. And one of the things that people talk about a lot is submerged breakwaters. So breakwaters you don't see, but they're in the system and they prevent waves from attacking the beach. The one thing I can tell you from doing this for a long time and looking at evaluating those types of structures is if a structure's underwater, it doesn't block the waves unless it's massive. And when I mean massive, like 50 times the size of a breakwater that sticks out of the water. So even though they are there and they do trip waves to some extent, you might see that, most of the wave energy just goes right over the top. So they really don't do much. So when people talk about submerged breakwaters, they're really not effective from that standpoint. So we're always looking at emergent structures as the best technique. And then it's how far offshore, what's the distance between them, all those types of things come into play. But if they block wave energy, that's the idea. And depending on where they are, they could build up sand all the way out to the structures. If they're close to shore and if they're further off, they just create a bump in the shoreline, and that's called a salient. This is the Five Sisters, four of the Five Sisters up in Boston. If you guys have ever flown over on the approach into Boston on Winthrop, these look small. They're 1,500 feet offshore, and they have boulders that are up to 30 tons on those. So those are some massive structures that were built in the 1930s. This is just a typical groin. Again, because of your wave climate, these types of 2-ton-ish stone type things are perfect, and they will last a long time in this environment. But I just, these are, again, you see that offset. We have the beach built up on one side, and on the other side, we have no beach because that's blocked all the sand as you looked at the downdrift side. And so for Cockle Cove Beach, I'm just going to go through a few of the alternatives we looked at. One of the things we wanted to see, what would it be like if we did put a groin in? And in this case, we were looking, and it doesn't matter if it's stone or wood, but in this case, we were thinking about wood as something that would be easy. If it didn't work, that it would be easy to take out. And again, we were looking at typical volumes of nourishment projects that might be done, somewhere around 20,000 cubic yards, which is a good-sized project by the county, but not too massive, and look at how that would perform. So we did a beach nourishment only, beach nourishment with one groin just to the east of the parking lot, knowing that we wanted to trap sand updrift to protect the parking lot that just wants to fall in the water all the time. And then having a series of groins that get shorter and shorter so we can kind of taper it down as we move along. And so those were the different examples. Cumulative length of groin is 100 or 220 in that example C. And then, as I mentioned, for Hardings, we didn't think that groins would work. Doesn't mean we weren't going to try them out. But we did a nourishment only. We did a couple of breakwaters right off the parking lot, closer in that were shorter but had a gap between them. And then breakwaters that were further offshore. And a lot of this, the reason why those distances and sizes were set had to do with we wanted to make sure that it was going to accrete some sand, but we didn't want the sand to build out all the way out to the structure. So that is the reason why they're set that way. And then groins to see how they would perform if we use them. And I'll go ahead and say that they didn't work very well there. So one of the things, so we go through the process of evaluating these. On the bottom right is what we call our design life curve. How long are things going to last? So if I'm doing that 20,000 cubic yard nourishment, there's 100% of it is here at day one. I've nourished the beach, and over time it disappears. It moves to the east and out of our area. So if I'm doing nourishment only, I'm getting all of it's gone in about 9 years, which is somewhere around what we expect it to happen. If I use the solitary groin, I'm getting really not all that much improved design life. But the one thing I do get is even though it's the same design life, I do get a little bit wider beach at the parking lot, which is what I was after in the first place. And the C3, the groins do a better job, and I get 12 years out of it. But the problem is that they have a huge adverse downdrift impact and create a huge problem for Ridgevale Beach as far as how much sand's getting there. Similar type thing with even less effect, but these are the four alternatives we ran here: nourishment only, two pair of breakwaters, 2 single breakwaters, and then 3 groins. And if you look at this, really the design life for all of them is pretty much the same. We're really not getting much bang for the buck out of any of these. That there's a huge improvement. As a matter of fact, the nourishment only is actually the best performing of the projects. So it's again not a huge surprise, because one of the things that you do is anytime you have a buildup of sediment in one place, you're robbing it from somewhere else. And that's the thing that you always have to keep in mind, because obviously mass is conserved. So if I'm trapping it somewhere, and if I end up trapping it behind the parking, in the area around the parking lots, I'm kind of robbing it from getting to the other parts of the beach. So within the area of the nourishment, I actually do best just by nourishing alone. So basically the summary there is that C2, which was the 20,000 cubic yards, and a wood groin actually does work the best, has the same design life as nourishment, but it actually maintains the beach in front of the parking lot. But I think you also need to consider the concept that you are going to have huge permitting challenges to do that, number one. And the reason why you have permitting challenges is that, again, it's the monitoring and the maintenance. So if you go forward with something like this and can get it permitted, you're going to end up with conditions that say you need to maintain that downdrift beach in perpetuity. So right now you can sort of let it go a little bit, patch up the parking lot with sand if it gets exposed. But if you go forward and have a groin, you're going to be hooked into a requirement that you have to maintain that downdrift beach. And I will say that having permitted groins, I'm somebody that I'm probably on my 8th or 9th groin project that has actually been permitted, but they are a huge challenge to permit. And because of the barrier beach nature here, where it's plover habitat, it would be extremely challenging here. I'm just letting you know ahead of time. And then Harding's Beach, again, the nourishment only alternative seems to be the way to go. And I think a lot of that has to do with just the nature of the transport there. It's not a big surprise to me. Everybody wants that wonderful structure that's going to make it work. But to be honest with you, what's being done now is actually been doing a great job, and I think continuing that is probably the way to go. And the other thing I should actually mention about structures, I don't think necessarily structures are ugly, but I will say that when people do go to a beach, if you have a structure, and especially wood structures, they do tend to be a block to people walking along the beach. So it is just something to keep in mind also. The rock structures, again, it sort of depends on where they are and how much beach width you have. Rock structures can work if you have a lot of upper beach, but with wood groins, they tend to come unburied much more easily because they don't have side slopes. So just something to keep in mind. So that is the end of the first half of the presentation. Now you'll be stuck with the second half, but I did want you to hold your questions on that. I'm sure people do have questions about this, but I will take those questions first when I'm done with the presentation. And thank you for your patience, because I know I'm dumping a lot of information on you. So this next evaluation is what's basically the 2017 Fool's Cut kind of triggered on the east side. So we're looking at the Crescent Beach and Stage Harbor entrance. Obviously the Fool's Cut has allowed sand to come around here. Immediately after the cut, within the year, we really started having some shoaling problems that got worse and worse in Stage Harbor. Obviously, you guys have spent a lot of money and a lot of effort to try to keep the Stage Harbor entrance clear. I know things have slowed down. We're aware of that. But at the same time, as I pointed out to Ted, one nor'easter can kind of change things, and I think we're all aware of that. One of the blessings, I hate to say it, but we'll look at these photos as we go forward. The Monomoy Refuge has decided not to protect their property, which is fine. Their sand is helping to kind of accrete at the south end of Morris Island, which is kind of protecting you, at least temporarily. So you can thank them for providing that material, or at least some of it. Not sure they feel that good about it. So I do want to give a little history about this area. So a lot of people, I'm sure you guys are most of them are familiar with it, but I do want to put it at least down in the diagrams. the inlet did used to be over here, right behind Morris Island. So this is something, when they were dealing with the last cycle of Nauset Beach system, before Nauset Beach got out in front of this area on the east side, this area was exposed. And I always think of the movie The Finest Hours? Yeah, so I mean, we always think of where these guys were going out of and what they were dealing with, but they were going out of this inlet. So it's a very unique area, very challenging, I'm sure at that time to get out through those shoal systems. But since that area was open, it was shoaling quite a bit, and so the Army Corps came in, did an evaluation, and decided to move the inlet. So they moved the inlet over to where we see it now and blocked this inlet. So Harding's Beach used to go all the way over to here, but they blocked the inlet, and so that is all an artificial dike. It's a sand dike, but it is an artificial dike that was built. And they also built, at the time, probably just so they could secure that dike when it was being built, they actually had a timber pile jetty out here. And you still see some remnant piles out there that do exist, but that was taken down at some point. But so you get an idea of how this has happened. And so we're kind of in the deja vu kind of thing where history always repeats in Chatham. So we're going through that process. This is kind of where Chatham was in the 1890s more right now than that time period. So we are probably going to revisit this in another 50 or 60 years. It's possible that there may be another breakthrough, Monomoy, that is going to open this up again. But we do think there's going to be a time period in between here where this is not going to be a problem, but it is a problem right now. And we expect it over the next 15 years likely to continue to be a problem. So obviously Fool's Cut broke through. This is what it looked like in 2011, right before the cut broke through in 2016. And then in 2020, obviously one of the things you see is North Beach Island growing longer and longer very rapidly. And then the Fool's Cut, when the break came through, you can see how deep that channel is. So even though there was a break in Monomoy down here, or South Beach, you certainly see that is all shoaled in and never had a good tidal flow. So when this broke through, and it's a deeper channel, this had a very strong current and continues to have a pretty decent current, even though it's more turned into an S curve. But I just wanted to kind of give you guys set the stage. At some point, this is going to collapse onto the beach, and Nauset Beach is going to grow past here. But again, we're looking at many decades into the future. So, but it is a cycle. I won't say we know where every feature is, but we know the general trend of what's going to happen. I'm going to grab some water here for a second. Not used to talking this long. Sorry. So one of the other things, more of a fine tune thing, one of the things I had mentioned is we have the beach growing on the outer here. But one of the things we do see is, over time, we see this wrapping back and this channel getting narrower. And with that channel getting narrower, it's really focused the currents. We don't anticipate that is going to grow all the way to the shoreline because there is a lot of tidal flow through there. But as soon as I say that next week it will happen, which is my luck, which is fine. Then the project goes away, so you're all good. But that has caused obviously some significant erosion because of how narrow that channel's become. So at the south end of Morris Island, where that last revetment is, we now have a very deep scour hole. I know that another firm is doing a lot of engineering work to try to shore up those revetments there. That is a huge challenge. It's a very difficult problem on both ends, where the refuge is kind of given up at that end of the revetment, and in the south end, they have a huge scour hole. And again, just a year and a half ago, I walked in front of that revetment, and you could walk up on the peat. So I mean, this is happening very, very quickly. So it's, even though an aerial photo might not show up that dramatically, the changes are incredible. So one of the things that we're looking at, since the Fool's Cut opened is, again, remember this is an artificial dike that the Army Corps built. It's just dredge spoil that was placed there. It's unarmored. And one of the things we see is that we're having an erosion rate of upwards on the order of 20 feet per year. And this dike isn't, the dike is pretty high, but it's not that wide. So it's, we're looking at, we might have, if things continue, we might have about 5 to 7 years before this thing's just breaches by, and that's without a storm, just kind of breaches because it's being eroded so rapidly. And the main reason why that's eroding is not because of a wave attack, it's just because the currents are so strong along there that they've just kind of ripped at the shoreline. And that current is basically unidirectional from the ocean into Nantucket Sound. So not a big surprise, that's what we see, and you can see, if you walk out there, you'll see that scarp. And actually you can see where you can actually see the layers of dredge spoil in there, so you can tell that where the core dike is versus where the old Harding's natural beach system is. But even at the Harding Beach end, there is dredge spoil up on top of there too. So we worked with Center for Coastal Studies, Graham Geis, who I'm sure you guys are all familiar with, and he kind of come up with some projections as to what we expect to have happen. Because one of the things it's like trying to come up with a permanent solution for this is really challenging. But by 2040, he expects this area to actually close off, so that we're no longer going to have the Morris Island cut. So that's a good thing. So any solution we need is going to be temporary. And again, the one thing I will point out, by 2070, he says, they're all going to join up, but he also warns, as you see this getting narrower, that we might, at some point, that might break through again and get us back to what they were dealing with in the 1960s. But again, I don't want to look there. We're really focused on just getting us through this time period now where you guys are dealing with a lot of shoaling problems in your entrance. So again, we depend on computer models, but one thing I will say, the computer models are all data-based. So we make sure we calibrate to conditions. We put out tide gauges. You see the tide plots up here, and we compare what the tide gauges do to what our model predicts. So that so we calibrate the model to make sure that we know exactly what's going on. Oh, don't do that. So we put bathymetry, the underwater topography in the model. There's a lot of shoals out here. This is the model grid. It has about 50,000 nodes where we're calculating flows and water elevations all the time. And you see the density gets denser and denser in our area of interest, in the Stage Harbor entrance area and along Crescent Beach. And then this is a quick show of results. And we are looking at all the data we collected. It was kind of in the 2018, 2019 time period was when we had the data. And this is just a movie, so it gives me a chance to rest for a second. But take a look at it. One of the things you'll see in this is that when the tide's going out, or the tide's low, which is when it's dark in the ocean right there, you'll see that when that tide's low, you see all the shoals that are exposed behind the barrier beaches. And the flow at that time is very low going to the east. But on the alternative, when the tide gets high, and it's flowing from the ocean over towards Nantucket Sound, that the flow is very strong. And it's not just strong along the shoreline, it's actually strong through the cut in South Beach as well. So, we have a lot of flow going through there, and that is all pretty much unidirectional, and it's taking all the sand, not just along the shoreline, but all those shoal systems and moving them all to the west. And you can see that when you look at aerial photos, you see those bands of shoals that are going to the channel. And obviously there was some focus a couple of years ago, 2021, into last year, where we had a lot of shoaling coming right into Stage Harbor Channel. So that's one of the concerns that, obviously, that is, pretty much your best, good, safe navigation channel. It's certainly a concern when that becomes such a shoaling problem, to the point where a few years ago you had the buoy sitting up on, sticking, on dry land, which is, and that happened so fast that it was a real problem for the dredgers to deal with. So this just gives you an idea of the maximum ebb currents, as we're calling them, or maximum currents going back to the ocean. Again, you see the size of the arrow is very small in general. The shoals are all dry. So even where you have high flow, it's going over such shallow water that it's really just not, it's not a huge volume of flow. Or when you have this, when you have what we call the flood flow, maximum flood currents coming in from the ocean through Fool's Cut, the water's deeper. It has very strong velocity, so it's a huge volume, much larger volume of water that's flowing from the Atlantic into Nantucket Sound. And that's really what's driving the whole system, ripping up the Monomoy Refuge headquarters all the way down along those revetments and across Crescent Beach. So what do we do with it? How are we going to deal with this problem? So again, you have to be that person that says no action. If we don't, what happens if we don't do anything? And then we looked at a bunch of different options that people had come up with, or we had come up with, depending on talking to different people. Reorientation of the entrance channel. Can we turn the channel a little bit more to the west to see if we get any benefit there? Inlet relocation. I'll talk about this in a little bit. I mean, they moved it in the 1960s. Why can't we move it again? Flow control structures. I'll talk about those more extensively, but also nourishment and temporary flow control structures. And when those alternative 4 and 5 I'll be talking about most extensively, but I will go through the others. And again, just a reminder of where the various things are looked at. This is the navigation channel now. I did put on the Monomoy boundary, which could be important from a regulatory standpoint. And in that picture with the dredge, just to remind everybody that what we have is we have a lot of sand coming in here, and that basically completely blocked the channel. So all that sand coming in from the east certainly was a problem. So no action. What happens? This is kind of an outdated picture now because this structure's gone. This structure's gone. Correct. So they basically have taken down most of their buildings at this point. That's not going to change in the near future. One thing I will say is so all of this is gotten much more eroded and deeper. So you're not just losing the beach along here. You're starting to have, because of how dramatic this is, you are starting to have an effect on some of the the resources that whether it be salt marsh, et cetera, where things are just getting torn up by the rapid changes that are happening. And it is something that nature does. I mean, you get the overwash, and it's not unlikely to happen in certain areas. You get a storm, and those types of things happen. But some of these things can be could have been mitigated before things got too bad. The other thing is at least in the past we were getting somewhere on the order of 50,000 to 80,000 cubic yards over that couple-year period where we're having to dredge to maintain Stage Harbor. Very expensive thing to do. But the one thing I want to point out again is that we're only looking at this being open for about the next, at the time, 15 to 20 years, probably 15 years at this point. This is just some model results that show where you have red, you're getting accretion, and blue, you're getting erosion. So it's just kind of a comparison, some of the use of the models, and I'll talk quite a bit more about that in a little bit. So one of the alternative 2 is that reorienting the inlet. So it's not that big of a deal. You reorient the inlet, but it's one of the things. It really is going to be short-lived because really where you're getting the shoaling is right where you have the turn anyways. So you're really not getting much bang for the buck there. And then it also is not reorienting that is not going to address the Crescent Beach issue. So if your Crescent Beach can still breach in the next few years, and doing nourishment alone is not going to help that. The other thing is moving the inlet. Everybody loves this one. But certainly we have to look at it. So obviously moving the inlet over to Oyster River is going to create all sorts of problems. Needless to say, we've got issues with plovers and salt marsh, et cetera. But again, you're going to increase the currents in Oyster River. You're going to have effects on the salt marsh there. I'm sure that the people who live on Oyster River would love the additional boat traffic. And you're probably going to have some adverse impacts on water quality up in Little Mill Pond. So you've got a lot of issues that this is kind of a non-starter, but it's something that's worth looking at just from a overview. But we didn't really look at it too seriously, and obviously one of the things we'd have to do is also fill the old inlet in. And then some temporary ideas, or some ideas we had for temporary structures, was what about redirecting the flow away from Crescent Beach, away from, because we do have, this is a kind of a unique situation, as I showed, that we always have pretty much unidirectional flow. It's going one way. Can we, in a riverine situation, you can always use vanes and those types of things to redirect flow, push it away from the bank that's eroding, and hopefully accrete sand somewhere else. So we looked at a bunch of options, having a structure that attaches to the beach and then having a series of vanes, because we want to have that structure that attaches to the beach to kind of be able to capture some of the sand. And in this case, we're not worried about downdrift impacts as much because we don't want the sand going downdrift. So it's kind of a good idea. So we have this whole series, and these vanes are just really intended to be sort of porous structures, but they slow down the flow enough so that they have a positive effect without having a huge adverse impact downdrift. And so lo and behold, I'll just go, this is actually the one that we chose that was most effective. And I'll be talking about that a little bit. So this is that flow control structure, and this is a model run with that flow control structure. As I said, the blue is where we're going to experience additional erosion. So right near the structures, we're going to get a little bit of scour right where the structures are, but we get this massive accretion right here, or increase in accretion, so we're going to get more shoaling just downstream of them because we've slowed down the flow. And then one of the things that's interesting, that the sediment never gets to the inlet, because that shows that, rather than having accretion there, we're not necessarily getting erosion, but we're knocking down the accretion to the point where it's not impacting the channel. So really the whole idea is here just to slow the flow down here so that we're kind of getting the sand to drop out right behind the structure as opposed to getting all the way to the inlet. Again, this is something that would only be needed for on the order of 15 years. So it's not a permanent structure. So, again, this would be very challenging to permit if it was a permanent structure, but because of the unique nature of your situation, it's certainly something that it potentially is a viable, and, CZM, Coastal Zone Management, has been funding the project to actually look at this, and, they're one of the regulatory agencies that would have to approve it anyway, so they know they know that this is a unique situation for the town. So this, it's kind of the preferred alternative. One of the things I just want to point out that we've been, over the last year or so, we've been improving on the data. Just, one of the things we've been seeing is, obviously, as everybody's been seeing, is there's an increase in accretion. You're right at the corner here. We've seen the shoal build up. So now the channel's kind of more of an S-curve. Crescent Beach is still eroding, so it is, remains a concern. And we're just not sure how long that shoal, if that's going to be stable, or if all of a sudden that's, a nor'easter can blow that out. This just gives you an idea of the level of detail of the modeling that we're doing for the structure. And the one thing I do want to point out, so this would likely be done by driving in sheet pile. So it's not the prettiest structure in the world, but it makes it easy to remove when it's no longer needed. The Army Corps did a wood dike, and even wood piles are sometimes difficult to get out once they're there, as you see the remnants out there still. Sheet pile is it's easy to grab with a barge and vibrate it right out. So that's at least the concept for now. And again, that just helps us again look from the regulator standpoint that they can condition something that once the breach is closed, or once that fool's cut is closed, that these things need to come out. And so along with those veins, we would be looking at doing beach nourishment. And as all we're really looking at doing is restoring the pre-2017 shoreline. That's the way the dike was, and kind of restoring it right to that. This is what the footprint would look like underwater, but this is basically the placement. And again, we're anticipating that if we put that material there, it's going to stay very well because it's, basically blocked the flow. It is, the one thing I will say, it is a relatively large nourishment. Doesn't mean the whole thing needs to be done, but it is 84,000 cubic yards, which, when this thing was really active, that's less than two years of dredging in Stage Harbor. And just pointing out what the Monomoy Refuge outline or boundary looks like. We are outside of it. That was not necessarily the perfect plan, but we worked that out pretty well. And I'm just going to go through a couple of these. This is jumping from 2018 to 2019. Kind of seeing the changes that were happening to 2020. You're starting to see that build up, May 2020, and you're starting to see this wrap back. 21, you're seeing more build up in here, and this wrapping further, and then finally May 2022, and you see that how that's grown, and you kind of see the S curve that we're still looking at. That flow is coming through that channel, so that just gives you an idea of how the system's evolving. And again, I'm just kind of throwing on the footprint of everything, just to give everybody an idea where everything lies. The orange is the old core project where the dike, you notice the dike actually was built in the Monomoy Refuge, even though the Monomoy Refuge was actually already in existence. Not quite sure how they pulled that one off, but they did. And it just gives you an idea of where things are. And one of the things we more recently talked about is basically, Ted has been very proactive in getting dredging zones because of all the channel migrations around. One of the things we're looking at for this is kind of developing a placement zone so that we can, if we need to, that if the channel shifts in a way that we need to move this or place it in a different location by the time permitting comes to fruition, that we can place it anywhere within this zone in order to make it the most effective. So that's the idea. Right now, this is the most effective place, but we want to make sure that we have the ability to potentially alter that if needed. And our next steps, we were under another CCM grant that just got funded in October. So we're in this year's funding, and what we're doing right now is developing permit level design plans, preparing that, the MEPA filing, which is the extended environmental notification form, which just gives, goes through the alternatives analysis and gives the agencies everything they need. And then we'll be preparing all the permit applications necessary to get the project moving forward. And with that, now that I have no voice, I'm going to open up to questions. And I'm going to start by asking if people have questions on the South Coast evaluation first. John, go ahead. Get a microphone? We'll torture you on the microphone.
Hi, I'm John Sweeney with the South Chatham Village Association. John, we are certainly supportive of everything we can do to protect the beaches of Chatham, which are such an important resource for us, not just for our enjoyment, but for the tourist industry and for everything else. John? Okay.
Now you got to start again. I'm just kidding.
John Sweeney, South Chatham Village Association. Okay. Yeah, we certainly support anything we can do to protect our valuable beaches because they contribute so much to the enjoyment of Chatham, but also to the economy and to the vitality of our local community. You mentioned that everything moves pretty much from the west to east along the South Coast. And we know that the beaches that are just to the east of Red River have had a lot of erosion, and it's been getting a lot worse. I've been walking those beaches for 35 years, and I can see just how much it's done. So I'm wondering, are there more things we can do to move the sand that's where we don't want it, because we have an excess of sand further east at Stage Harbor, and we have a lack of sand, all the way down to Red River Beach.
Sure.
Partly because of the length of the groin at Red River Beach in Harwich. Anecdotally, I know that now we have a lot of people from Chatham who go to Red River Beach to walk because it's such a nice flat beach. And we have a lot of people from Chatham bringing their dogs down to walk on Forest Beach because it's better for the dogs than it is for some of us. So anyway, looking at what can be done in order to use that sand, which is a resource, since we can't harvest it offshore, are there ways that we can move that sand further west so that all of the beaches benefit on the South Coast? And that sand will then move along all the way east. And by the time it gets to Stage Harbor Inlet, hopefully it will have been deposited. The second thing I wanted to mention is that it seems to me that we're not only talking about a system of the entire coastline, but we're talking about a system that includes very valuable marshes, both at Red River and particularly at Forest Beach Conservation Area. Those marshes serve so much as a resource, not only to protect the land behind them because those barrier beaches block, but we might have a breakthrough, but they also ecologically, and they also store a lot of carbon. So as we look at that whole environment we're looking at, There's so many implications of what we do. It's not just to protect the beaches, but it has a lot of impact on a lot of other areas. And with climate change, they're becoming even more important. So I wonder if you'd comment on that.
I'll do my best. The first question about getting sand further to the west. I hate to make it simple, but I mean, really, it comes down to finances. That we do have the county dredge that works in the town quite a bit, and one of the issues with the county dredge is it can only pump so far. It's not the most powerful dredge in the world, but it's made for the inlets, for the inlets that we generally deal with all over the Cape. So the fact that it can't, it would probably need, even if you put another booster pump in it, it gets to the point of being very inefficient to pump that far, all the way to Forest Beach, and over the Red River. It doesn't mean you can't get a project to do that, but I think you would likely look at having to hire a private dredge from doing the channels like Stage Harbor. The alternative also we've talked about is, Ted's going through the process, or the town's going through the process now of potentially looking at where the Corps dumps material off Hardings Beach, as using that as a borrow source for sand, and that's closer. And there might be some economical, I'm not quite sure, again, the county dredge might not be the dredge, but you might be able to get a smaller dredge that could pump it all the way to Forest Beach. The only caveat I'd say is when you stockpile Forest Beach, one of the issues that has come up, obviously Mill Creek jetties are kind of filled to entrapment, or the jetty is right now. So when you get a lot of sand that comes right over there and starts that process of building the spit out in front of Mill Creek. So you want to make sure if you're doing that, that you also proactively, and the town has permits to do this, excavate the material just updrift of the jetty, and that can be trucked down the beach. But that material, you want to make sure that when you do a nourishment project at Forest Beach, you're just not overloading the system. So you just need to make sure, because right now that eastern portion of that system is kind of overloaded with sand, where the area, obviously where the houses are, is not. So if you're going to put the sand where the houses are, you just need to make sure you don't rapidly create problems at Mill Creek. Now the climate change issue, or the marshes, certainly the whole point of protecting barrier beaches, besides what we do for shore protection, it does have that value of habitat. So the folks that look at plovers and least terns and all of those types of things, they want it protected. The marshes are also, Division of Marine Fisheries want that protected. So even though they may give us a hard time about the projects we do, just because they're trying to make sure they're done in a environmentally responsible way, they ultimately are also trying to protect those resources. So I think that is a consideration. And when we're in permitting of projects, one of the things we kind of get to the point of is like, okay, I see what you want us to do, but if you push the town too far, they get to the point where they're just not going to do the project. And you want this project done, so let's come to the table and get things done. So I think we're all aware of what the marshes, the estuaries, everything that's behind the beaches, and why we need to protect the beaches. I think the regulators are aware. Certainly the coastal engineering community is aware, the town's aware, and I think we all are working together to make sure that we can keep the longevity of that as well as possible. It's sometimes easier to sell it to townsfolk as just shore protection, but there's a lot more aspects to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff Dykins. That was a great presentation. In terms of the South Coast, I bugged Ted and Dr. Bob and others for years about doing groins in the Nantucket Sound, and I think tonight you've convinced me that perhaps that's not the way to go, and that we perhaps stay the course with replenishment rather than works, than putting in groins and jetties, if you will. So I think the approach we've taken to get dumped sand as far west as we can and watch it accrete where it will, as naturally as it can, I think may be the way to go. But I have other questions on Crescent Beach and Stage Harbor. Can I go there too or not?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So the veins is fascinating. Have other communities or coastal communities used veins, maybe in rivers and stuff, but I'm not so sure I've heard or seen them being used in the ocean or in tidal areas, in strong tidal areas, number one. Number two, what are they made of again, and how are they affixed, and what would the cost be? And the second part of the question is, if we're going to replenish then Crescent Beach along with veins, if that's the approach that I think I hear you recommending, then do we get the sand to replenish from the Stage Harbor Channel as we are now at times? Is that where we would grab that sand?
So the answer to that last question, yes, we definitely, Stage Harbor would be the place to get the sand. And I think that and again, we've looked at it as restoring what was there in pre-2017. But we don't have to put all that nourishment there. We're just, I hate to say it this way, we're doing the Army Corps' job for them, because they really should be maintaining their own project. But that is their dike that the town would be maintaining. As far as the veins, it is actually kind of a unique concept. It does get used a lot in the riverine environment, but it is not something that's common in the coastal environment, because the situation you have is just very unique. I can't think of any place where you have unidirectional tidal flow like you do here. This is just such a, it's just the tidal dynamics between the Atlantic Ocean and Nantucket Sound are so unique. I mean, the only other place I can think of, like on the East Coast, that would even be remotely similar is sometimes at the Cape Cod Canal, where you have, the whole Bay of Fundy, Massachusetts Bay, very large tides, and then you have a much smaller tide in Buzzards Bay, where you can probably get something similar. But there's been no reason to do something in that place. So this is I think it's just a unique situation, but it is definitely more of a riverine type, and it is pretty common to use veins in rivers to prevent bank erosion when you get those oxbow lakes forming and that type of thing. So, what's that?
Steel?
Oh, that's it, yes. These would be made out of sheet pile, so it'd be sheets driven next to each other, sheet pile, just like you see on the bulkhead that you're doing and so it'd be those types of things. And we haven't calculated the depth that they'd be driven to, but they'd be driven down with a vibratory hammer and then vibrated out. So again, they're not pretty. I'm not gonna lie to you. This is not for aesthetics at all. But it does make it so that from a temporary standpoint, they're much easier to get out. And that's really, it's not just selling to the regulators, but it's a cost savings too, from the standpoint, because you're probably gonna have to, there's probably gonna have to be a requirement for some sort of escrow account to be put in to have these things removed. So it's that type of thing to think about. I don't have a cost yet because I don't know how deep we're driving them. I think this is something that from the town standpoint that they might want to try to get funded with cost share from the state. I don't know if the feds would cost share as well, but certainly, CZM, the Dam and Seawall program through DCR, there are some programs that might be useful to either get zero interest loans or partial payment or 75% cost share. There are programs out there. So, but I think that this is the type of project that would qualify for those types of funding. Okay. Anybody online? Nobody? Nobody wants to ask me questions?
No. Do we have any questions for any of the folks online? If you do, you'd have to unmute yourself. Doesn't look like it.
I answered everybody's questions. I like that. That's good.
Guess that means you did a great presentation, John.
There you go. Well, thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Just for the select boards and, well, the town in general, as John indicated, we are in this permitting phase through the ongoing grant that we've now had for a couple years running. Don't assume that if we get permits, that we're now going to build this thing next week. This is still something that will need a lot of discussion. There are navigation issues associated with placing structures. We have to have good buy-in from the boating community. We have to buy in from the shellfish community of where these things are going to be placed. So there will be a lot of community discussion if we get through this permitting phase, and there seems to be some legitimacy to, being able to put them in. Then it's a decision that the town has to make. Do we want to do it? Or do we just continue presumably to do what we've been doing? And that's not my call. That's our administration and policymakers' call, which will be an interesting discussion down the road. As John indicated, we've seen a modest reduction in some of the shoaling issues, at least at the Stage Harbor Channel this year. That's a very good thing. And we've seen a modest reduction in erosion at Crescent Beach. Will that change this winter? I don't know. Will it change in 2 years? I don't know. But at least right now, the crisis isn't as bad as it had been the last couple of years. So we're taking a little bit of breather from that perspective. But just because we're going into this permitting phase does not mean at all that we are at this point recommending that we do build them. That will have another major round of discussion. Other than that, absolutely.
I just have a quick question. Has the solution that you're discussing been used anywhere else along the coast? And if so, how's it working?
I actually know it hasn't been used, as far as we know. So it's just because this is kind of a unique, again, that one-directional ocean system, this is just not something we ever see anywhere. So, when we start tackling this project, we started thinking about rivers rather than oceans. And certainly riverine stuff, I can come up with many examples where this type of thing works. They're usually typically more permanent, but it's generally, the way I'd always seen it was like out in Iowa where farmers had their crops. You would start getting these S-curves set up, and they break off as oxbows, and you see that in old streams. But they would start being, an oxbow would start forming and getting towards somebody's house, and they would want to redirect the current. So they just put in these veins to redirect the currents, and it would actually drive the river a different direction and keep the erosion away from where they didn't want it to erode. So it is a common hydraulic engineering thing, but not necessarily an ocean engineering thing. How's that?
Nobody else online? So if that is it, I thank you very much. For those that are online, appreciate it. And for those that are viewing, feel free to give me a call or check in with us if you have questions down the line. So thank you very much. Yes, Bob?